In this session, we're going to talk about the focus of your policy lens, if you will. I tried to pick something that would be controversial without any bloodbath in discussions across. So I tried to avoid things like euthanasia and abortion, but tried to talk about something I think really is important for our era, and different systems are dealing with it differently. And that is what you could call conscientious medicine, or conscientious practice. That's I prefer conscientious medicine, but that's because I'm an egocentric physician. Conscientious practice is fine as well. Conscientious refusal or conscientious objection is sometimes used. The point, if you use one term or the other, kind of shows your hand where you are in the debate. Classically, conscientious objectors, that is viewed in a slightly different way than a refusal. But I prefer conscientious medicine or conscientious practice, which probably shows my hand as well, but it's a newer term. In that the question is whether a physician or a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant or a physical therapist or occupational therapist or a respiratory therapist or a whole host of other people, whether they can decline being involved in a procedure, being involved in certain treatments, or taking care of certain patients based on a moral decision. The classic example of this is abortion. And most hospitals have a policy on conscientious refusal around elective abortion, or around abortion at all. Many, especially state institutions or academic medical centers, don't participate in elective abortion, qua elective. But many of the policies cover all abortions at large. So I want to talk just a little bit through the kind of policy issues in general, policy and positions, which I think we've covered in previous lectures and coursework, but policy and positions, the challenge of that. Then I want to deal a little bit more specifically with conscientious medicine. The challenge with of bringing a policy to fruition, to actually realizing a health system policy or a position statement, as we've previously found in, this is ethics according to me, not everyone will agree with this take, you should know that. That's why you have readings from people that have different perspectives. Please read. The challenge is in a pluralistic society where we don't agree on where we come from, where we're going to, or what the good and the valuable is. We don't have a shared ethic. How do we come to a consensus statement? Well, as we've discussed, there is no consensus in a consensus statement. Position statements and policy statements are based on the group that is gathered and what kinds of power they can trade off, whether they're willing to compromise to bring a policy or not, and there generally is no consensus. Even things like the Belmont Report show us that, in the Belmont Report, they didn't agree on what justice was. They just said that justice may be important, especially when it comes to research ethics. So they didn't really come to a conclusion on a deep, rich, contextual basis of what justice or autonomy or beneficence or non-maleficence. They didn't come to agreement on what those exactly were in a precise way, but they had a statement from amongst disputing parties on what may be needed for research ethics to move forward and to move away from the scandals that had been revealed, and to avoid government intervention. So a policy or position statements, whether this is for an American Academy, so the American College of Physicians or the AMA or the various different groups, or whether it is hospital policy or university policy or grant-making body policy, you're going to have disputing members come about making these policies. And one of my goals of this course is for you to experience that. And the reason for that is one, you get to learn, well, how to at least get a taste of what it's like to compromise in these position statements. The other is it will help you when you read them. So if you have a position statement from the AMA, it's not "Thus saith the Lord." It's not "Thus saith the AMA." This is foundational truth. This was a political position at one given time by a group of people. Now, it may be a good position, especially if it's one that I agree with. I'll like it. But if it's one I disagree with, then I want to use whatever political power I may be able to muster, if I have the energy to do so, to change it. And this is that term that we've mentioned before, that modus, well, I'll lose my, I'm off the board here. So I'll say modus vivendi. That is, it is a way of peace amongst disputing parties, until such time as you can change it, until you can bring enough rebellion to change the position. Here, we're not talking about armed rebellion, we're talking about peaceful kind of political power in a system rebellion. So, political or position statements and policies and even laws and regulations aren't foundational truths that are unchangeable. They're political statements written by a specific group at a specific time for a specific vision. And it's usually not a shared vision, it's a whole cluster of visions. And just to get it done, people compromise in all kinds of ways to further a policy. If you want to read more about this, I suggest kind of the theory behind the practice of how we really come to consensus. There's a book, James Buchanan, an economist, won the Nobel Prize, and he and Gordon Tullock wrote a book called Calculus of Consent. Buchanan also wrote a book on defending constitutional liberty. And I find those books to be compelling on the way consensus in these kinds of positions really work, that there is no real consensus. It's about this political give and take, this compromise. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I have very particular positions on all kinds of things in medicine and health, but I've worked my whole career in a secular, public, academic institution that much more at law and in policy for the health system, much more was deemed ethically permissible and permissible in the system and at law in the state than what I would have if I were the king of that region. I would not be as permissive as the hospital policy or the state regulations and laws allow. But I choose to work in those systems, and I impact policy, and sometimes I will describe the law and the society at large and the difference of opinions. Sometimes I will state my own position. Oftentimes I'll state my position when it comes to this policy level issue, and I try to mitigate for something that I think is right. Now, I also don't die on every hill. I don't lay down my stake and say this must be done. If I'm going to be here in ethics, then the system can't participate in abortion or in palliative sedation or something like that. Palliative sedation is a whole different topic that we cover in end-of-life ethics. I can't say that I'm all for or all against. I just have pause over it. I did help write the position statement for the American Academy of Hospice Palliative Medicine. I think it's a good position statement. I think the position statement on assisted dying, physician-aided dying, is not. I did help draft a draft. It was not the approved draft, but that is an example. And my experience with the American Academy of Hospice Palliative Medicine is a case in point. I think I've shared this before. In our position statement, we had a committee, all met by phone and over emails, but we never met in person. That was made up of two people that were really opposed to assisted suicide, me included. included two people that were actively participating in assisted suicide. One had only participated once, but she still was for it, though she said it was so emotional she would never do it again. And the other members, the 3 or 4 members, were somewhere in between, that they had never participated. They don't think that they would participate, but they thought that in extreme circumstances it could be ethically justifiable. Some thought it should be legal, some thought it shouldn't. How could we come up with a position statement? And if we were all physicians at the same health system, how could we come up with a health system policy? If we are all asked by the governor of a state to help draft, to form a committee on end-of-life ethics, what advice would we give the legislators and the governor? Well, I don't know. I can say that I thought the American Academy of Hospice Palliative Medicine did a really good job at the ethics committee level. The physician aid in dying position statement was such a hot potato, though. It got moved into other committees and went to the lawyers and went to the board of directors multiple times. And what came out, I don't think is a good statement or helpful in any way. But despite the great diversity in the group, I think there was something that was said that was helpful. Now, it wasn't what I want to say. I want to say I think physician-assisted suicide is evil and wrong and should be illegal and never practiced. And I furthered that as the first draft, and of course it was rejected. So I have a choice. I can either excuse myself from those debates and say, well, if I can't have it exactly my way, I won't participate in any way. And there are times for that. But if you do that, you're going to lose all influence in that group. I actually think this has happened quite a bit in ethics committees, especially with the conservative voices leaving out of anger and frustration of change. So we've seen ethics committees and professional statements move, if you will, to kind of a more permissive stance on abortion and requiring abortion for trainees and allowing for assisted physician aid in dying. Really, the American Academy Hospice Palliative Medicine is kind of standing alone on that right now, with it being observed neutrality, which I think is not helpful at all. I'm opposed to that statement. But we see the shift, and many have taken themselves out of the debate. I choose not to take myself out of the debate in most things. Some other aspects of life I do. So in the policy formation, I mean, if you're going to practice in a given system, it'd be helpful if you're at the table to help draft a policy that will impact your practice. In forming policy must be workable. As a former healthcare administrator for a system, I must emphasize that if you want to get in trouble, either legally or through regulations, accreditation bodies, then pass a policy or a guideline and then don't follow it. If I were asked to do a legal review on a questionable end-of-life care case, one of the first things I might ask a lawyer is to provide me that hospital system's own policies. And if they violate their own policies and regulations, then it's pretty easy to show that they're probably in the wrong. And same with accreditation bodies. You have to follow your policies. These shouldn't just be writing tomes to go into a big book, or now, I guess, a big folder on the internet or on the intranet of the hospital system. And they should be something that's helpful, readable, and actually going to be followed through with. Now, so all kinds of ethics policies are made. Often they come from an ethics committee and move into, after approval, they may go to a subcommittee of the ethics committee. They may have been dealing with something that came up from a case. Beware of making too many policies based on cases. Hard cases, just kind of the legal side of things, just like complicated cases make bad law. Hard cases can make bad policy in the hospital as well. But you may experience some cases that warrant taking a look at the policy, or you may have a consultation. Other medical staff or hospital staff may ask for the policy to be reviewed. Ethics committee reviews that, maybe in a subcommittee, maybe it comes to the full committee. And then after approval in the ethics committee, it would move on to potentially other committees to approve it, but eventually to whatever the system's medical executive committee would be. And this is often true with insurance companies, pharma, many other organizations as far as their policy goes. So when you're coming together as an ethics committee, how do you deal with disagreement? I encourage people to show their bias respectfully, unless it's something that warrants disrespecting. There are some positions that should be booed out of the room, but that's not exactly politically correct these days. But this is the way I often teach as well. Some professors will try to say that they're objective and neutral and then give information in an objective and neutral way. I think that's very dangerous because the subtleties and nuance will usually try to guide the student in a particular way. I try to tell all my students my bias up front, and that way they know it, and then I try to be fair and honest with all sides. So I encourage that kind of approach when you're dealing with positions or policy statements. Now, for the American Academy of Hospitality Medicine, I said in the first meeting when we were talking about physician aid and dying, I said, let's go around and say what our position is. Let's be transparent about it. I think that's helpful. It's not necessarily so. It's not necessarily helpful. But I think it is helpful to kind of share the bias and be explicit but kind. Most of these policies aren't, I don't think, are that difficult. What about conscientious medicine? Why do I choose that? I choose that just because it's one of the questions of our age that isn't end of life or beginning of life. It really impacts anyone who's in any type of clinical practice or in government regulation or in insurance or even in science. There are some things in science that conscientious refusal, conscientious practice even impacts some researchers. Think about stem cells and et cetera. Some genetic manipulation. A scientist who's in a lab may say, but isn't the superior in the lab, may say, I don't want to participate in that. Is that allowable? You have some readings on this topic, and the questions that you may have include who can be allowed to refuse or to object or to have a conscientious practice. Is it just physicians? Is it physicians and nurses and social workers? Is it researchers too? For the sake of your policy, we're doing hospitals, so don't focus on research, focus on clinicians. So who may object? Under what circumstances? And you may have on what basis. So classically, religious conscientious refusal has been protected. The U.S. Federal law, Supreme Court hearings, Supreme Court rulings have a special respect for religious refusal. Now that's been somewhat shifting over the last 2 decades, at least, probably really over the last, since the 1940s, it's been shifting. And especially since the 1970s. Those of you who have heard other lectures from me, I put a lot of the 1970s, and Lemon versus Kurtzman is a very key U.S. Supreme Court ruling that laicizes, officially makes the United States very secular, or secularist even, that you need a secular intent behind laws. It hasn't been consistently applied since its ruling, but that's a very important ruling. But as a religious basis, the only reason why someone should say, no, I don't want to participate. if an atheist says, no, I think this is wrong, just because they can't call upon a formal Protestant denomination or say that they're Muslim or Jewish or something like this, should they be coerced to do something that they think is morally wrong? So that's a question for you to ask, for you to answer. And then, are there limitations? In this, I remember some of the challenges in the AIDS epidemic, HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 1980s and 90s. And I'm aware that there were dentists and physicians and emergency medicine personnel that if someone came in with HIV, with AIDS, they would refuse to treat. Is that permissible? Can you say that's against my morality? Well, the challenge with this is that it probably wasn't based on a moral judgment. It was probably fear of being contagiousness. But in some cases, maybe it was moral. Maybe someone said, oh, they've lived this lifestyle and this is their retribution. I'm not saying I hold that, but I'm saying you can imagine that, especially as this was a disease at the time of homosexual men, that there may be a moral judgment in place by some. Is that acceptable in your system? I have deemed that it wouldn't be acceptable in systems that I've been part of. I wasn't in charge when that was happening of any ethics group, but were it a question today, I would not allow it. I'll be interested to hear what you think. At the same time, what is a moral distinction versus a clinical one versus fear or miseducation is difficult. In the Ebola outbreak, I can guarantee you that I would have, we did have many personnel that were fearful and did not want to treat patients with Ebola. Now, can you imagine if being a single mom with 2 kids at home and being a nurse on the floor and someone says an Ebola patient is coming in and you have to treat them? Well, all of a sudden you have to be away from your children for 21 days in isolation. At least that was the protocol at the time. That may not be acceptable. So it may not be a moral judgment of I don't want to take care of that kind of person. It may be more of a practical refusal. In our system, and there's a YouTube presentation out there on this, on Ebola specifically, that I've done. We asked for volunteers and had more volunteers than we could handle before we even asked. The word got out that volunteers were going to be needed, and the Ohio State University system had a lot of volunteers ready and had Ebola response teams ready, just in case we had something more than a scare, which there were some in Ohio. Scares, that is. Potential cases. So are there limitations of something that would not be acceptable? Would it be emergency care? Would you allow, it's another test case I often use, would you allow a Jehovah's Witness hematologist who won't prescribe blood, or a trauma surgeon that's a Jehovah's Witness? Now, in your policy, you probably wouldn't want to deal with all these strange hypotheticals, but you may want a method of saying that you can't just refuse anything, and having some sort of process if someone has an unusual refusal. And then there are other consequences. So are there consequences? I've heard John Lantos, who's at Kansas City but was at the University of Chicago for a long time, pediatrician by training, very smart man, very kind. I've heard him speak, and he's written on this as well, that conscientious objectors historically have, though their conscientious objection has been allowed, often it has consequences. If you conscientiously refuse the draft in the military based on religious belief, You may have to serve in the Merchant Marines, or you may have to serve in a different aspect of the military, or you may have prison time. Is that how we want medicine to act? My view would be no, but I think that we're in this is a quickly shifting policy matter. So to give you full disclosure, you can find references on conscientious objection for anything you want to back up. Everything from Julian Savviescu, who's the head of ethics at Oxford, has written that if a physician is not willing to do everything that's legal, then they should be exited from the profession. That's a very strong statement, and one that I think is problematic and probably very easy for a philosopher to say. However, he's not the only one that says it. In philosophy and law, painting with broad strokes, this has gained in popularity. The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law had a conference that one of the talks, one of the considerations was conscientious refusal, and one of the ideas was really this is a bygone era, that this needs to change. They had more of an idea of societal, not just medicine involved, but there was an idea amongst legal faculty. This is probably a very quickly changing idea. At the College of Medicine, we had a conference on conscientious medicine and practice, and the physicians that attended all assumed, of course, we can refuse. So some philosophers, some lawyers, and maybe a few physicians are increasingly saying that there shouldn't be a great deal of liberty given, but it's still the prevailing judgment at law, Supreme Court cases, etc., is that conscientious refusal can be protected. So Julian Savviescu is at one pole probably, and then you have others that Far Curlin, Dan Macy, and Pellegrino, who has passed, Tristan Engelhardt, myself. I'm probably at a pretty far pole of allowing conscientious practice, and Loris Kaljan, I think, is a moderate end, and that's one of the assigned books. So he's for conscientious practice, but I would say he's a very mediating voice. So this is for your consideration. My view is that we shouldn't coerce people to do something that they think is inherently wrong or wrong against their morality, etc. There are I've had some clinical cases that are difficult on this, though. If a cardiovascular surgeon intubates someone, takes them into the operating room, brings them out, and they're dying, and they're even awake and saying, please take me off the ventilator, and the whole family's saying, take me off the ventilator, I would take the patient off the ventilator, and the surgeon can't do anything else to save the patient. Everyone knows the patient's dying, but yeah, and then is refusing to remove the ventilator. That's a problem in a system. It's illegal probably, and something probably needs to be done. And if it could be transferring the patient to another physician's care, but that may take intervention from the administration, that kind of refusal may not be tolerated. Not honoring a do not resuscitate order. It was very popular in the 1980s and early 1990s to have a conscientious refusal policy on taking care of a DNR patient. So we need to realize how quickly things have changed. I've seen multiple of these policies in hospitals I've worked for, or I've done consulting with, that they'll have in their DNR policy, they'll have a conscientious refusal clause, or they'll have a whole statement and policy on conscientious refusal, on a refusal to care for the DNR patient. Because when DNRs were becoming popular, it was seen as something that wasn't, that was against medicine. And the medical practice was to save life and a further life, and not to give up on life. And so that resuscitation seemed to be an obligation of the physician by some. That's really changed quite quickly. Why that is, we can cover in end-of-life ethics course elective. But know that things have changed quite quickly. But if I had a physician that wouldn't honor DNR in my system, I would probably have to have an intervention. So think about these issues. Think about that this is not saying what's inherently right or written in stone, a foundational belief. This is really what is politically acceptable in a system, and you're going to have a small group that you're writing a policy with. Reflect on that some and why you chose certain groups. It doesn't have to be exactly this list, but these are some of the things you'll have to consider. Good. I hope you enjoy this process. I hope it does bring home the point that consensus is elusive, if it's possible at all, and that you have to have a workable policy that's practical and can be followed. And the details of these kinds of policies, I like having policies that are somewhat nebulous, in that that gives us ability to deal with dynamic, messy cases without clearly violating. Now that doesn't, I'm not saying I'm not being a relativist or trying to be soft on ethics. When something's wrong, it's wrong. But I like having a little bit of nebulous language where we can use wisdom and not just saying our policy is the following. Okay. Knowing that you can always violate policy, you just have to defend why you're doing that and hopefully notify the right people. Good. Enjoy the project.